So our third speaker this afternoon is Catherine Marshall. Catherine is a former senior curator at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin. She has taught art history at Trinity College Dublin, University College Dublin, and the National College of Art and Design. She's co-editor of Art and Architecture of Ireland, Volume 5, 20th Century, and a contributor to the Atlas of the Great Famine. The title of her pamphlet, volume, is Monuments and Memorials of the Great Famine. Catherine.
Hello everybody. I'd like to start by thanking Grace for inviting me to be part of this presentation this afternoon, and if I could just get straight into it, I suppose the question I'd like to address, a number of questions. Do monuments and memorials do what we think they do? Or paradoxically, do they actually help us to forget the event that we claim to be commemorating? What is it that they really commemorate? What criteria should be considered in the future for commissioning them? The first of these questions was raised by Leotard. Should I just move on here? Okay. Was raised by Leotard, who argued that monuments undermine other readings of historic events and deny wider ownership of them. Leotard aims this challenge at the grand tradition of monument making, and I'm showing you one grand monument from Renaissance Florence, just a Renaissance Venice, just to give you a little bit of background on the monument. He attacks the grand tradition of monument making, which is oligarchic and is imposed on the community for the purpose intended. Erich Rogoff argues that by imposing a symbolic object, a monument, in the place of an absence, we create a new presence, the potential for new memories, but we do not satisfy the sense of loss caused by the historic event that it displaces. It leads instead, she argues, to closure, to forgetting the event. The grand tradition works better for the heroic than for the suffering. It makes the representation of Irish history and class and gender histories virtually impossible. But it was that tradition that Thomas Davis invoked in The Nation in 1842, just before the famine. When we speak of high art, he said, we mean art used to instruct and ennoble men, to teach them great deeds, whether historical, religious, or romantic, to awaken their piety, their pride, their justice, and their valour, to paint the hero, the martyr, the rescuer, the patriot, the saviour. Holocaust and Irish famine studies highlight the need both to tell a story and to erase it. They help us to understand the impact of history on the psychological state of generations. Terence Brown and other writers believe that many Irish problems today can be located still in the famine. And I quote Terence Brown, "The black humour of so much of our literature, our moods of desperation, our compulsive, fearful materialism, our pessimistic expectation of failure, our sense of national incompletion, of silence as our truest language, having lost the native language, of hunger as a defining appetite, stronger than the desire to procreate, can all be traced back to the famine." Mary Daly and Cathal Porter remind us of the importance of the individual as well as the collective, that folklore humanises history. Monuments, because they're artwork, do a similar job to folklore. The construction of a historic monument is a creative act, not a piece of historic research. And so it is essential to understand the conventions surrounding it. Now, Niamh has already talked about some of those, so I won't repeat them, but they include the critical context of the work, the commissioning circumstances, and the relationship to its physical and cultural surroundings. These factors shape the outcome as much as they are nuanced by history. So that discussing his New York monument, Brian Tull, who was the artist responsible for it, summed up the relationship between the artist and the historical source. Sorry, I didn't need to move that on. So back again. He summed up the relationship between the artist and the historical source for many artists when he said, "History functions for me like a raw material. The idea of research, as it applies to my work, is really about a level of engagement. I don't approach history trying to prove a theory. If I'm lucky enough, something materializes in the form of a work. Yet this is something I can't predict. I'm not assuming the role of a historian." Another writer, Kieran Benson, argues that the self is tied to location, and that we cannot really know who we are if we're separated from our place and the stories of that place and our past. Benson is interested in the therapeutic aspect of the relationship between self and location. It was fear of nationalism, of nationalist memories of place, that led the British government in 1842 to prematurely close down the Ordnance Survey memoir, which had been researching historical monuments in Ireland. The Freeman's Journal recognised their motives. It said, "Rulers feel uneasy when nations destined to serfdom have such recollections. Better they should die out. And this terrible consummation is likely to be attained if our governors have only the determination to forbid the completion of the work." Sorry, I keep tipping the computer here, removing that. Okay. Erskine Nichol's racist paintings that Niamh already referred to of Famine Ireland gave comfort to those who perpetuated the idea that the Irish were to blame for their own difficulties, and there is an Erskine Nichol on the left. And they were not deserving of British generosity, not to mention government aid. The few Irish artists who attempted the subject either disguised it, like Daniel McLeish did, or were soundly criticised for it. Ireland remained a colonised country until 1922, and the colonial establishment did not favour monuments to Irish history, while those that celebrated British imperial achievement tended to be vandalised rather than enjoyed by the Irish. But monuments to heroic efforts, such as the 1798 rebellion, did actually follow during under the Free State. But in failing to address the famine, the Irish merely followed the tradition of public monuments elsewhere, which sought to commemorate and inspire heroic action, rather than to mark a trauma that was still too close to living memory, or that primarily affected the poor. And another tradition, the literary tradition of Ashton poetry in Ireland, has an impact as well. This continued throughout the 19th century and dealt with dispossession and hardship by personifying Ireland as a beautiful woman who would eventually be rescued by the heroic male poet and his friends. Irishmen felt ashamed by their inability to meet the dream of the Aisling. Imagine their despair when they found themselves unable not only to sustain that vision, but to feed their actual dying children. Perhaps that is why Irish male artists couldn't face this history until the Celtic Tiger restored morale and gave them the opportunity not just to make art about the famine, but to make it expensively and assertively in bronze. And there's another gender trope here as well. Margaret Kelleher has drawn attention to another subtext relating to gender representations of famine in Ireland and in India. Kelleher looks at the dislocations between representations of famine as a suffering woman with or without dead or starving children and the statistics. She points out that women actually survived in greater numbers than men. But the personification of famine as adult female, therefore, states, as adult female, therefore, relates not to the actual event, but to patriarchal culture, which sees woman as other, as nature, while the creative man turns it to art. In the public monuments of the Great Hunger in Ireland, the majority of which are by male artists, the trope of the passive, suffering woman is a strong feature. I'm going to just move on a little bit. There were other reasons too for avoiding the subject of the famine, and in fact I had intended to put in an image here of a painting by Paul Henry, but I forgot it when I was sending this in advance to Claire. The Irish Free State in the 1920s channeled its scant interest of art into the promotion of artists like Paul Henry. There's a very fine example of his work here in the Quinnipiac Museum. Henry provided an image of Ireland unaffected by outside influences, primitive but homely, with cosy cottages, turf stacks, lakes and mountains. The viewer's ownership of the scene in Henry's paintings is never challenged by occupants of the place. Instead, the famine, which had depopulated the west of Ireland, and Henry had spent the years from 1910 to 1919 actually living on Achill Island, which still shows some of the worst signs of famine, desolation and dereliction. But Henry never once shows a derelict cottage in all of his hundreds of paintings of the west of Ireland. The London Midland and Scottish Railway Company used a painting of Connemara by Henry to advertise, proclaiming that it illustrates in a striking manner a typical phase of Irish scenery. Ireland, the new post-war Ireland, the ad goes on to say, is now ready to welcome the English tourist and wishes you to explore the beauties of her coast and countryside. Now that ad came out in 1926, just 4 years into the independence established in 1922. The war so tactfully referred to is the War of Independence against Britain, and yet British travel agencies and Irish governments alike were ready to put animosities aside in the interest of commerce. Removing traces of the famine was essential to furthering the holiday atmosphere. Most commemorative projects result from public commissions, but the initiative often comes from individuals. Local initiatives took the form of simple crosses in cemeteries, or emotionally powerful in their anonymity and modesty, they claim neither artistic status nor historical insight. Edward Delaney's monument, though, a significant monument, you'll see it if you look in at the pamphlet. There's a significant monument to the Irish famine, which was made in 1967 by the sculptor Edward Delaney. It's tucked into a corner of St. Stephen's Green in Dublin and forms the obverse of a commemorative statue to Wolfe Tone, from which it's concealed by a screen of standing stones. Delaney was given a state commission for his memorial to Wolfe Tone. And when he was asked why he finished the Wolfe Tone monument off with figures of starving and dying people at its rear, he said that the famine represented the failure of Tone's heroic enterprise. So I suppose my argument is that representing the famine in 1967 in a major public commissioned monument was possible only because Edward Delaney could attach it to a heroic monument. The positioning of Delaney's memorial opposite but hidden from the Shelburne Hotel across the street, a great symbol of wealth and power in Ireland, is deliberately ironic. The sense of helplessness, shame that accompanies abject poverty is rendered even more telling in such an environment. But the most persuasive and direct response to the famine came in a body of work by Alana O'Kelly, who presents an alternative feminist approach to the subject. Her works, which took the form of performances, photographic works and tape slide installations using sound and text as well as imagery, are, I think, the best, they're the best artistic response to the famine coming out of Ireland in the last 30 years. Anti-Irish racism, fueled by IRA bombing in London in the 80s, her family roots in Connemara, images of famine in the developing world, and empathy with parents struggling to feed their children, led O'Kelly to engage with the Irish experience of hunger. The work that emerged from the late 80s to 1994 was not commissioned. It grew directly out of her sense that the work simply had to be made. Using a variety of ingredients, including workhouse records, Irish songs, photographs, of lazy beds and human bones in the landscape, images of nature and nurture, alongside oral references to contemporary world famine, O'Kelly created a trilogy of installations, one of which is here in the Irish Famine Museum. Significantly, O'Kelly keens in the traditional mourning ritual performed by Irish women over the dead. In the trilogy, she keens and laments for the dead in the Irish language, which, like keening, was almost wiped out as the Great Famine devastated strongholds of Irish traditional culture. Paul Ricard, inspired by Freudian distinctions between mourning, an active engagement, and melancholy, a disabling state, speaks of the importance of mourning as a process of working through the complex legacy of the past. O'Kelly's work can be described as an imaginative way of remembering that focuses on positive emotions, on such positive emotions as love, and paves the way for reconciliation with that past. In their clear avoidance of a single narrative, and I'm showing you here a large clip, or a series of clips from the video work by Alan O'Kelly that is here in the Irish Famine Museum. What she does in this work is she avoids a single narrative, a single mode of communication, because there is singing and performance as well as a series of images, and avoiding a prescriptive way of looking at events. O'Kelly's artwork undermined traditional notions of what a memorial should be. They require time as well as space. They cannot be comprehended in a single empowering glance, foreclosing the possibility of instant judgment. They're non-didactic, leaving viewers to absorb them and to take responsibility for their own performances. They're located in museums where they're not likely to be shown permanently. That means that, like the viewer, their appearance is flexible and sporadic, dependent on public demand or curatorial decision. Unlike public monuments, which may be said to colonise the space they occupy, these installations await the viewer on equal terms. Yet their museum locations call attention to them as works of art, as well as commemorative projects with a public remit. O'Kelly's work encourages grieving, an active engagement with history, an opportunity to work with what David Lloyd has referred to as Ireland's unworked through loss. They remind us that famine still exists. Interpretations of the famine narrative that concentrate on the success of economics or the birth myths of safe arrival in new countries bear out the analysis of Leotard and Rogoff, that the presence of the monument is less about commemorating the event it is named after than it is a marker for a new phase in that history. So that, for instance, Celtic Tiger monuments to the famine in Ireland risked reworking it, less as a disaster on an unspeakable scale, but rather as a yardstick to say, look how we've prospered since then. Not all commissioned monuments to the famine follow those routes, however. The names of over 600 emigrants who died in 1847, carved into Kilkenny limestone in Ireland Park, Toronto, and the sheets of glass edged with the names of Irish orphan girls in the Australian monument to the Great Irish Famine in Sydney, do not attempt to superimpose a narrative on the event. They simply provide a place to remember and mourn. By resisting the traditional response of specific figurative presences in favour of a symbolic language text, particularly lists of names, they link Ireland's mass tragedy to Maya Lin's modern alternative to the grand narrative, the Vietnam Veterans' War in Washington. This combines the narrative, the collective, with the singular, and instead of the narrative monument that turns the horror of war into glorious achievements, the wall recalls the enormity of the loss as name is added to name. So I'm going to finish by talking about the Irish Hunger Museum in Battery, or Hunger Memorial in Battery Park in New York. It was partly built from the excavation of the World Trade Center. It's dedicated to both the Irish famine and to world hunger. Brian Tull avoided depictions of famine victims too. Instead, he created a sloping quarter-acre site, exactly the size of holding that disqualified occupants for poor law relief in famine Ireland in 1847, using earth, fossils and plants from Ireland, and he topped this with a derelict cottage. The wider context is presented in miles of text. Letters, biographies, folklore, poems, songs and recipes on the entrance tunnel from the street below, blended with references to contemporary world famines and issues around consumption and obesity. Chosen with Maureen Murphy, these texts are presented democratically and without chronology. All around the memorial, one of the world's most energetic centres of capitalism pursues its daily purposes, proving, as Tull insists, that hunger is not abstract, it's a fundamental problem of the human condition. By rejecting traditional elements, O'Kelly and Tull enable us to become participants, and by omitting human figures from representations of human figures. Instead, we walk Tull's acre, wondering how we would support a famine from it. We look at the big houses of capitalism all around it and wonder what they have in store for us next. History's not over, we're still living within it.